We're going to look in the Sermon on the Mount today as we talk about say what you mean and mean what you say, because there's a section in the Sermon on the Mount where I would sort of paraphrase that as being Jesus's message to the people on the side, that hillside that day. You have heard the law that says, Jesus said, a man can divorce his wife by merely giving her a written record of divorce. But I say that a man who divorces his wife, unless she has been unfaithful, causes her to commit adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman also commits adultery. You have also heard that our ancestors were told, you must not break your vows. You must carry out the vows you make to the Lord. But I say, do not make any vows. Do not say, now watch this next segment, because I'm going to explain it for you, and you may learn something you didn't know. Do not say by heaven, because heaven is God's throne, and do not say by the earth, because the earth is his footstool, and do not say by Jerusalem, for Jerusalem is the city of the great king. Why did he say three different things? We'll talk about that in a minute. Do not even say by my head, for you cannot turn one hair white or black. We know that's true, don't we? Just say a simple yes, I will, or no, I want. Anything beyond this is from the evil one. So here in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is talking about the value of our word. When we make a promise or take a vow, do we follow through? Do we have integrity? In other words, how trustworthy are you? How reliable is your word? When I was growing up, my father said to me many times, son, your word is your bond. And lots of times people made business transactions just by a handshake, just by their word. And their word carried a lot of power. Folks went out of their way to deliver on what they promised. But I'm sorry to say, I think those days are long gone. It seems to me that today, contracts, vows, promises are made to be broken. I mean, it's obvious it's been true in marriage, but it's also true among business executives and coaches who sign a long-term deal and they're just waiting till something better comes along to get out of it. Athletes sign a long-term deal and then they'll hold out to get a renegotiated deal and to get something different. Politicians and journalists massage the facts, not to give an accurate picture, but to advance the narrative that serves their purpose. People are concerned about the truth only as long as it helps push their personal agenda. Sort of reminds me of the man who had been Christmas shopping at the mall and he was hurriedly backing out of his parking space when he hit the car behind him. And a large crowd in the mall parking lot saw the accident and saw what had happened. So the man got out of the car and realized other people were watching. He went back in his car, got a piece of paper and a pen, started writing a note. Looked like he was writing several lines, put it on the windshield of the damaged car. And all the eyewitnesses were impressed. They said, now here's an honest man. That's the way people used to do things. He's left his name and his address and his insurance company. Well, a couple hours later, the owner of the damaged car came out of the mall and saw the damage and the man's note, and the note read, I just smashed your car. The people who saw the accident are watching me. They think I'm leaving you my name and address and insurance company. I am not. Good luck. Welcome to our modern world. Truth has taken a hiatus in our modern world. Today, deception, half-truths, exaggeration, over-flattery rule the day. In other words, we say whatever we need to say to get whatever it is we think we need. That's the new rule. Honesty and integrity, for the most part, are not the norm. The norm is say whatever you need to say to get whatever you need. And that is not, Jesus said, how a Christian should navigate his life in the Sermon on the Mount. He has a better way for us to live, a better way for us to relate to one another. I could sum up and paraphrase what we read in the Sermon on the Mount as this: a Christian should say what he means and mean what he says. That's honor. That's integrity. That's truth. That's what Solomon was talking about in Proverbs 22:1. He said, a good name is more desirable than great riches. To be esteemed is better than silver or gold. A good name is better than great riches. Your word is your bond. Your word is your bond. All you have to stand on is your word. I love the story about the preacher who told his congregation one week he was assigning them homework. I do that every now and then. Did it just a couple of weeks ago. Asked you what you thought 17 inches was going to mean for the next week. But this preacher had told his congregation he was going to assign them all some homework for next week. He wanted everybody in the congregation to read John chapter 22 before they came to church during the next week. He got up the next Sunday. He said, how many of you read John 22? Over half the hands went up. He said, that's interesting because John only has 21 chapters. They had lied, and they had not just lied, they lied in church. Got to be something a little worse about that, don't you think? And yet, that's sort of what Jesus is addressing here in the Sermon on the Mount. Because he's addressing the Pharisees, and the Pharisees often lied or stretched the truth, and they often lied in church. And so Judaism had put such a great premium on truthfulness and faithfulness that in Proverbs chapter 6, when Solomon was listed the 7 things the Lord hates, the very first one he listed was a lying tongue. A lying tongue. Now, the Pharisees claimed to value honesty and integrity, yet, as they often did, they said one thing and they did another. And so, as Jesus said in the text we just read, you have heard that our ancestors were told, you must not break your vows. You must carry out the vows you make to the Lord. The Pharisees claimed to value honesty and integrity, but what they really did was make promises, and he gives 3 examples of this, make promises and vows while they were only looking for loopholes, how to break them. Under the Old Testament, vows and oaths were a device that God had given his people to promote honesty. When you took an oath or you swore by a third party, you were asking a power higher than yourself to hold you accountable, to judge you if you failed to keep your vow. That was the whole purpose of this. That was the whole purpose of the oath. They reinforced your commitment to the promise. And you were asking someone to hold you accountable. The Hebrew writer talked about this. He said, now when people take an oath, they call on someone greater than themselves to hold them to it. And without any question, that oath is binding. We're to say what we mean and mean what we say. We're to tell the truth. We're to speak with honesty and integrity. Now, the system of third-party oaths was intended by God to bolster our respect for the truth. But as usual, the Pharisees had twisted the intent or the spirit behind God's law and interpreted it in a way God had never intended. The Pharisees made oaths not intended to uphold the truth, but to undermine the truth, to look for loopholes. It was like, do you remember when you were little, did you ever do this? We did when I was growing up, but it may be out of vogue, I'm so old. We would make an oath or a promise and we'd cross our fingers behind our back. Yeah, well, I can see some of you are old too. And so then after you'd said it and made the promise, you'd say, fingers crossed, That's what the Pharisees were doing all the time. They were constantly looking for loopholes. So they invented a classification of oaths. And Jesus talks about their classification of oaths here. Certain oaths to them were binding. It depended on the stature of the third party you invoked. So they invented a classification of cascading oaths, you might say. The highest classification was, I say, do not make any vows. Do not say by heaven, because heaven is God's throne. So if you really meant to keep a promise, you really intended to keep your vow and your promise, you made a vow by heaven, because heaven is God's throne. If you kind of meant to keep your promise, but there might be some exceptions there, you would make your vow or your oath by the earth. So Jesus said, don't say by the earth, because the earth is his footstool. If you were pretty wavy on whether you were going to keep this oath or promise or not, you would swear by Jerusalem. So Jesus said, do not say by Jerusalem. Don't swear by Jerusalem, for Jerusalem is the city of the great king. So are you seeing the cascading effect here of the power of the third party in your oath? Heaven's the highest, then earth because it's God's footstool, and then Jerusalem because Jerusalem is just part of earth. And then you get down to the one where you got your fingers crossed behind your back. Don't even say by my head, for you can't turn one hair white or black. Now, again, the intent behind all this oath making was getting out of the promise, not upholding the promise. That's why Jesus loathed their oaths and said, just say a simple yes or no. Anything beyond this is from the evil one. Stop your cascading series of oaths. He's teaching that mere words should never be a substitute for honesty and integrity. He is teaching we should say what we mean and mean what we say. Now, I've said this before in various ways. When I was a kid growing up in Nashville, Tennessee, there was only one major college in Middle Tennessee, and that was Vanderbilt University. And there are a lot of smart people there, but there aren't any athletes there. And but because it was our only university in the city, my father liked Vanderbilt. And like a lot of situations, he passed on his love for Vanderbilt down to his sons. And so I chose Vanderbilt as the team I would follow. And over 55 years, that is the worst decision I have ever made in my entire life. But there was that's truth. But there was a professor at Vanderbilt named Dr. Madison Surratt, who was a legendary professor in mathematics. He was head of the mathematics department for years. People loved him. He taught there for decades. The Student Center is named the Surratt Student Center. And there's a long told story about him that before each test, he would say to his class, students, today I'm giving 2 exams. One exam is in trigonometry and the other exam is in honesty. I hope you will pass them both. But if you have to fail one of them, please let it be trigonometry. There are a lot of good people in the world who cannot pass a trigonometry test. There are no good people in the world who cannot pass an integrity and an honesty test. What a wonderful thought. And what a great truth. And here's where we get tested by Jesus. How committed are we to honesty and integrity? How do we behave when nobody but God is watching? Are we honest? Do we say what we mean and mean what we say? And here's what's interesting, and this is where we'll spend most of the rest of the lesson. The area where Jesus focuses most on that in this text is marriage. Marriage. He says marriage should definitely be the place where we say what we mean and mean what we say. Marriage is the place where integrity and honesty starts. So in verse 31 of in this section, remember he's talking about telling the truth, saying what you mean, meaning what you say, keeping your promises, keeping your vows, keeping your oaths. He said you can have heard that the law says a man can divorce his wife by merely giving her a written notice of divorce. A written notice of divorce. As the Jewish system of oaths allowed you a way out of your obligation, so did the Jewish system and its teachings on divorce. A man can divorce his wife merely by giving her a written notice of divorce. You see, the law of Moses allowed for divorce on the grounds of uncleanness. Let's go back and read it. It's in Deuteronomy chapter 24. Suppose a man marries a woman, but she does not please him. Having discovered something wrong with her, that is a very wide and broad interpretation. He writes a document of divorce, hands it to her, and sends her away from his house. When she leaves his house, she is free to marry another man. But if the second husband also turns against her and writes a document of divorce, hands it to her, and sends her away, or if he dies, the first husband may not marry her again, for she has been defiled. That would be detestable to the Lord. So I want you to understand something in the beginning here. God's law did three things. First, it turned divorce into a legal proceeding, which it had not been prior to the writing of Deuteronomy 24. We've just read it. All a husband had to do, men had all the rights, all a husband had to do prior to Deuteronomy 24 was kick his wife out. Kick his wife out. That's all he had to do, send her packing. He didn't even owe her bus fare. He didn't owe her nothing. Not even a certificate was involved. So Deuteronomy 24 comes along, and God institutes some new rules through the law of Moses. He says, first of all, divorce will now be a legal proceeding. You have to give a certificate of divorce. Second, it established a cooling off period. The certificate slowed him down and made him think it all through. He couldn't come home one night, get mad, as some of the scribes were saying, get mad, toss her out of the house, and that's it. No knee-jerk reactions. The man was now forced to think through the implications of his actions and his decision. So there was a cooling off period. He had to wait for a certificate of divorce. Third, once you divorced your wife, you could never remarry her. That was not true prior to Deuteronomy chapter 24. In other words, if it dawned on you later that the divorce was a mistake, you couldn't rectify it. You had to live with its finality. The reason for that also was to make you think it through carefully. Look, all three of those aspects of God's law were intended to discourage divorce, not encourage divorce. Before they were put into effect in Deuteronomy chapter 24, there were no rules, no laws. Just divorce them, kick them out in a minute's notice. So these laws were intended to discourage, not encourage divorce. God wanted to make divorce more difficult, not easier. Deuteronomy 24 wasn't meant to condone divorce, but to postpone divorce. Prevent it, not permit it. Erase it, not excuse it. And it's Deuteronomy chapter 24's interpretation that Jesus is asked about in the most common passage quoted about marriage and divorce and remarriage in all the Bible. In Matthew chapter 19, a teacher, a scribe, a Pharisee of the law, asked Jesus, why did Moses say that a law that a man could give his wife a written notice of divorce and send her away? Why did Deuteronomy 24 say this? And Jesus said, Moses permitted divorce only as a concession to your hard hearts. But it was not what God had originally intended. So understand what he's saying here. The law of Moses made a concession to human hard-heartedness. Rather than face a rash of murders and domestic violence, God allowed for divorce and gave a 3-part procedure for it. Sort of reminds me of the woman who was asked, when did you discover a certain chemistry in your marriage? And she answered, well, when I found the chemical arsenic in my cornflakes. That was sort of the tip-off. That's funny, and if you don't get it, you'll get it later. Once again, the Pharisees failed to interpret correctly the intent behind God's law. They focused on the letter of the law and ignored the spirit of the law. Deuteronomy 24 was God's attempt to keep people married. Understand this point, or you'll never understand the principle of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Deuteronomy chapter 24 was intended by God to keep people married, to keep people from easy, quick, no-fault, harsh divorce. That's what it was intended for. But the Pharisees had turned it around and used it as an excuse for divorce and an easy way to get divorce. And so they focused on the term indecency or uncleanness. Deuteronomy 24:1 says, if a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him, I'm reading in the NIV now, and remember I said that's an awfully wide area of interpretation, isn't it? Because he finds something indecent about her. And that word is where we've had lots of controversy down through the years. And so the Pharisees had begun to define indecency as just about anything. So much so that it was just like it was in the days before Deuteronomy chapter 24 was written. Just like then. So if indecency could mean anything basically the husband or the rabbi wanted it to mean. In fact, there was a rabbi, one of the best known ones named Hillel, who gave a whole list of things that you could use as a definition for indecency. I'm quoting him. If a wife spoiled her husband's dinner by putting too much salt on his food, if she was seen in public with her head uncovered, if she talked with other men on the street, if she spoke disrespectfully of her husband's parents. And as I've read through a lot of these, it's amazing how times seem to have changed in a couple of thousand years, and yet people remain the same because the honest to God truth is I've heard some of that same kind of stuff sitting right over there in my office. The excuses offered by Rabbi Hillel are no better than some of the ones I've heard today. Like the wife who gave birth to 3 sets of twins, and her husband complained about her being overbearing. Yeah, see, I was not going to move on until you laughed. If I had to stand here until 2 o'clock this afternoon, I was not going to move on until you got that one and you laughed. You see, no matter how much you start out loving your spouse, a good marriage takes effort. It takes work. You have to learn that love is more than an emotion. Love is a choice. It is a commitment. It is a vow. It is an oath. Love is more than just a tingle up your spine. If you've got a tingle up your spine, you may have the coronavirus. Love is more than that. Love is a choice. Love is a commitment. And you got to stick with it. And you got to sometimes do things you wouldn't want to do to make things right. Like the story I love about a wife who fell into a deep depression. And her husband took her to a psychiatrist, and after speaking to both of them, the psychiatrist told the husband, I know the cure for your wife. The cure for your wife is very simple. He then walked over to her, gently put his arms around her, kissed her on the lips, patted her on the back, turned around and walked back to his psychiatrist's seat. And the woman had a big smile on her face. And the psychiatrist said, see, that's what you need to do to put her life back together. And the husband was stunned and finally said, okay, Doc, I'll bring her in on Tuesdays and Thursdays and you can kiss her. You see, Moses allowed divorce because of the hardness of our hearts, the scripture says. But if you don't take anything else but this out of this building today, I want you to take this out of this building. Just because Satan gives us a hard, cold, stony heart doesn't mean we have to keep one, because one of the great promises of God is that the Lord will give you a new heart and will put a new spirit in you. I will take out your stony, stubborn heart and give you a tender, responsive heart. Jesus is able to soften hard hearts. Jesus can take a stone-hard heart, soak it with grace, knead it with mercy, soften it with sensitivity, inject it with love, and make it as soft as a baby's cheek. That's what this verse is saying. And that gives Jesus the right to raise the bar on marriage. Moses couldn't do anything about the people's hard-heartedness. Moses, good as he was, wasn't Jesus. So because of their hard-heartedness, he had to let his followers get a divorce or they'd kill each other or hurt each other. Whereas Jesus is able to change a hard heart, and that's why he prohibits divorce. So he says in our text this morning, I say that a man who divorces his wife, unless she's been unfaithful, causes her to commit adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman also commits adultery. And the rest of the New Testament takes divorce off the table for the followers and disciples of Jesus with two exceptions. Unfaithfulness, he said, unless she's been unfaithful, and I'll get to the other one in a minute, but let's talk about unfaithfulness first. Unfaithfulness there in the original language is the word porneia. It's spelled P-O-R-N-E-I-A. We get our word pornography from it. But it had a wide definition in first century. A very, very wide definition. It could refer to adultery. It does specifically in this text. It could also refer to incest or pedophilia or homosexuality or prostitution. It had a wide definition: indecency or unfaithfulness. So Jesus is saying if your spouse engages in any type of sexual activity outside of the marriage covenant, then you are free to divorce him or her and remarry. But take note, even there, divorce is not commanded, it's just allowed. God has and can repair the damage caused by marital infidelity. I've seen it many, many times here in our own church. Reconciliation may be painful, and that's why divorce is permitted, but it is not commanded. And I've seen many marriages put back together because God is able to give a loving, warm, committed heart to those who have a stony, cold, hard heart. There's another biblical grounds for divorce and remarriage that's given in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And that is abandonment. Paul said if the husband or wife who isn't a believer insist on leaving, let them go. In such cases, the believing husband or wife is no longer bound to the other. For God has called you to live in peace. Say your spouse is an unbeliever, he or she no longer wants to remain married to a believer in Jesus. The believer can move on and start over. Is no longer bound. So here are two biblical exceptions for divorce and remarriage. Sexual immorality, wide base, broad base for that word unfaithfulness, and abandonment. So listen to me. If he gets fat, or she grows crabby, or somebody loses a job, or the kids are driving you nuts, or she runs up the credit cards, or he plays too much golf, or he hurts her feelings, or she neglects his needs, those are all problems. Those are all problems that need to be solved. But the answer is not to break the covenant, vow, and oath of marriage. Because Jesus, unlike Moses, can change a person's heart. Pray about it, talk it over, work it through, get some help, have some patience, throw some love and faith in there. But do everything you can to keep your vow, keep your commitment. You see, the Bible also tells us in the book of Malachi what the Lord thinks about divorce. It gives us a crystal clear glimpse into God's attitude about divorce. Didn't the Lord make you one with your wife? In body and spirit you are His. And what does He want? He wants godly children from your union. Pay close attention to those words. He wants a Christian family anchored by a father who is a leader in the Lord, alongside his wife who is training children in the nurture and the instruction of the Lord, and children who obey their parents in the Lord, for this is right. So guard your heart, remain loyal to the wife of your youth, for I hate divorce, says the Lord, the God of Israel. To divorce your wife is to overwhelm her with cruelty, says the Lord of heaven's armies. So guard your heart, do not be unfaithful to your wife. Divorce is hated by God for two reasons, according to this text. First, it says straight out, it breaks the heart of God. It breaks the heart of God. It damages the picture that God is trying to paint in every believer's marriage. You and your spouse are a spiritual snapshot of Jesus and His church. That's what Ephesians chapter 5 also says. And divorce blurs the picture. And the second reason that God hates divorce is it breaks the hearts of those who are forced to deal with its consequences. Those who are forced to endure it. It damages the feuding adults and the kids they drag through it with them. You see, we tend to think when we're mad at a spouse, we tend to think that divorce is a sniper's rifle. And the only person that you will affect is the spouse that's in your sights. But that's not true. Divorce is more like a pipe bomb blast. The ramifications are widespread and far-reaching. And stuff you never intended to damage ends up being destroyed. And people you never intended to hurt end up hurting and maybe damaged. So the Bible teaches that marriage makes us one flesh. When children are born, they become part of that union. That's the word that is used, union. And emotions and dreams and identities and desires all intertwine. And so think of it, if you want to do it with me, think of it like your fingers on your hand. You know, you have a husband and a wife, in body and spirit you are His, and He wants godly children from your union. And so here's the husband and wife and the children, and it's all completely intertwined. All of their emotions, their dreams for one another, their identities, their hopes. And you can't separate those appendages without a lot of bleeding, a lot of tearing, a lot of hurting. Remember, you took a vow, you made a promise, you gave your word. Say what you mean and mean what you say. Whether it's at work, at church, in your neighborhood, in your country, especially in your home and in your marriage. Because Christians are people who value their word. Their word is their bond. They stand or fall on their integrity and their honesty. Now look, I got to say one more thing before we get out of here today. If you've made a promise you didn't keep, and you think it's too late to do anything about it, you are wrong. The whole message of the Bible is you can forgive, and forgiveness matters. The whole message of the Bible is all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, and God sent a sinless Son to pay the price for our sins and to forgive us. You can be forgiven, and forgiveness matters. It allows us to start over. It gives us God's power to avoid the same mistakes in the future. It gives us that heart that only Jesus can create that replaces that stone cold heart. And if you need to be forgiven, He'll help you begin again. Jesus will help you become the kind of person who keeps their word. He will help you become the kind of person who says what he means and means what he says. That's the whole point of those verses in our text in the Sermon on the Mount. Don't take a vow by heaven, by earth, by Jerusalem, or by yourself unless you intend to keep it. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Say what you mean what you say, and particularly do it in the most important relationship that you will ever have on earth, and that is in your home with your spouse or with your children.